Welcome back, everybody. It is my true pleasure to introduce our next guest, who I have known since I was, I don't know, 5 years old, something like that, or so. So David Dow is the Cullen Professor at the University of Houston Center, where he writes and teaches in the areas of contract law, constitutional law and theory, First Amendment, and death penalty law. He is the critically acclaimed author of The Autobiography of an Execution, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the winner of the 2010 Barnes & Noble Discover Award for Nonfiction. His second memoir, Things I've Learned from Dying, was named by NPR as one of the best books of 2014. His most recent book, Confessions of an Innocent Man, published in 2019, was named one of the best books of the year by the Wall Street Journal and has been shortlisted for the Crooks Corner Prize. David is the founder of the Texas Innocence Network, Texas's oldest innocence project, and the co-founder with his wife, Katya, who I also know and like, of the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project. David runs a death penalty clinic, and along with his team of lawyers, students, and interns, he has represented more than 110 death row inmates in their state and federal appeals. David, welcome to the conference today. It is great to have you, great to see you, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Leonard. It is a pleasure to be here. And yes, I guess we've known each other for a very long time. I've probably known you since around the time that you were born, since I'm older than you.
Yeah.
And thanks for inviting me to talk here at the seminar today, which in past years I've attended as a participant and have just been holding out for an invitation to get an opportunity to address the folks that you work with and that work with you. Leonard asked both my wife and me if either one of us was able to talk today about race in the criminal justice system. My wife is the one who actually runs the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project at the University of Houston and represents children, and Fridays are her day in court. So that means that I'm talking to you alone rather than in partnership with her. And my expertise, as Leonard was mentioning, is largely in the death penalty area, not the juvenile area. But I'm going to talk today at first a bit more generally about race in the criminal justice system. And then I'll transition to talking a bit more specifically about the death penalty system. I'm planning on leaving time at the end of my presentation for questions, but as I've discussed with Catherine, if in the course of my remarks I say something that is confusing or that just doesn't make sense to you, then if you will go ahead and send a question to Catherine at that point, then she will ask me to clarify. But if it's anything other than clarification or confusion, then I'll address those at the end, or at least do my best to address those at the end. I'm going to be talking about particular aspects of race and the criminal justice system today, but I'm only going to be talking about certain aspects. And so I thought it would be a bit useful if, before we take a deeper dive into the 2 or 3 specific aspects that I'm going to talk about, I suggest more broadly what all of the different potential spots in the process are where we can actually see racism manifest itself. And I'm not going to talk about each one of these 6 different stages today, but I do suggest that if you're interested in a particular stage that I don't talk about, that you either reach out directly to me, and I'm easy to find. If you just go to the University of Houston Law Center website, you can type in my name and it'll give you my email address. Or another thing that I encourage many people who have wide-ranging intellectual curiosity to do is to set up an account with the Social Science Research Network. That's SSRN, Sierra Romeo November.com. And you can set up a free account. And there is a enormous variety of scholarly articles that are uploaded to that site before they are published in journals. I probably upload, half or three quarters of my scholarly publications to the SSRN website before they actually come out in the journal, and you can search by subject matter areas. And so if you're interested in an area that I identify today but don't talk particularly much about and want to learn more, that is absolutely a resource that I would commend to you. The first area where we can see race in the criminal justice system are simply in the reports of crimes themselves. And we can identify racism, of course, because only about half of all crimes are reported to police. And there are a number of reasons for that, but obviously one reason is that some population and demographic constituencies in cities have historically better relationships with the police force than others do. So if you have a house break-in or an automobile burglary in a middle class or upper middle class white area of town, that crime is much more likely to be reported to police than if you have the exact same crime occur in a low income part of town or a part of town that is populated predominantly by people of color. So one area that we can see racism in the criminal justice system is simply in the counting of crimes itself. A second area where we can see racism is in the number of people arrested. And the reason for that is that every different layer of the criminal justice system is imbued with all kinds of discretion that individuals have. So police officers have discretion, prosecutors have discretion, a police officer can choose to arrest or not to arrest. In some jurisdictions, police officers can write a ticket rather than arrest. And so arrest rates themselves are not going to tell us all that we need to know about who's actually committing crimes, simply because at the point of contact between the wrongdoing and the state, the police officer has discretion to do what the police officer wants to do. The next layer where we can see discretion operating is at the charging decision. What typically happens is that a crime is committed, it is reported, the police either make an arrest or don't make an arrest. If they do make an arrest, the person is taken in front of a prosecutor who decides what the charge is going to be. And the charge can vary quite dramatically from something like a typical nonviolent burglary to an aggravated burglary or an aggravated assault and burglary. And that decision is a charging decision that rests within the discretion of the prosecutor. And that discretion is largely not reviewable, which means that when the person who was arrested is taken to the jail and in front of a prosecutor, and that prosecutor makes a decision about the charge, that decision is, for all intents and purposes, final. Sorry about this. The next place where we see discretion is at the trial itself. And there are a number of different reasons that we can see racism manifest itself at the trial. One, of course, is that people who earn less, and those people in the world that we live in are disproportionately people of color, are less able to hire quality lawyers. And quality lawyers, just like quality doctors, just like quality financial advisors, matter a lot, and you get what you pay for. And so if you're not in a position to be able to afford high quality representation, you're going to get lower quality representation. And the people who tend to be in the least desirable position to hire counsel are people of color. Moreover, and unfortunately, trial judges continue to this day in the 21st century to exhibit unfortunate biases against certain individuals and against certain classes of individuals. I've represented clients in the last 2 years, who were tried in front of judges who made egregiously anti-Semitic or racist remarks, either in the presence of the jury or outside of the presence of the jury, but indisputably made those types of remarks. So when we talk about racism in the form of judges who preside in criminal trials, we're not talking about remnants from the 19th century or even just the 20th century. We're talking about things that still happen today. Next, of course, after somebody is tried and convicted, the person is sentenced. And sentencing can vary very dramatically. It can vary from no time at all in prison to what is effectively a life term in prison. And of course, in recent years, I think there's been some significant attention that has been paid to disproportionate sentencing of people who commit aggravated sexual assault, where young white men in particular who are convicted of aggravated sexual assault, rape, or attempted rape receive what is comparatively a slap on the wrist as compared to people who commit the identical crime but are not white middle-class people who happen to be in college. And then finally, there are consequences that follow the imposition of sentence. Even after somebody is sentenced to prison, people often have the opportunity for early release through the form of parole. Once people serve their sentence and fulfill the terms of their parole, they are no longer under a punishment sanction and they re-enter into society, but the consequences of their wrongdoing can persist. One of the important projects that my wife has undertaken on behalf of juveniles is to erase the records that they acquired as juveniles, not as adults, but as juveniles, because the existence of that record can continue to have deleterious consequences in terms of enlisting in the military, getting financial aid to go to college, getting a job. And so somebody can make a mistake when she or he is 12, 13, 14 years old. And unless the consequences of that are subsequently addressed, that youthful mistake can continue to haunt that person literally for the rest of her or his life. I'm going to be talking today primarily about sentencing when we're talking about racism in the criminal justice system. And so I thought that I would start by just putting some general crime data on the screen so that you can get a sense of how significant the crime problem is in the United States. The incidence of crime has been going down, not, I would say, dramatically, but consistently for about the last decade. We are currently in the United States experiencing an uptick in homicide, although all other crimes continue their downward trajectory. Nobody is really quite sure why we're experiencing this uptick in homicide. The best theory that I've seen so far are people who study homicide who have suggested that because people are being either physically required to stay at home or there's public pressure on people to stay at home, there are more opportunities for crimes, for violent crimes in neighborhoods, and that's translating into increased homicides. We obviously will not be in a position to test that until we have the current pandemic under some modicum of control, but that's one theory that I've seen. But as the screen indicates here, 5 years ago, there were a little bit over 1 million violent crimes in the United States. That climbed for the next several years until 2018, but we've seen a decline in the last year. And so in 2019, there were 1.2 million reported violent crimes. And that means that violent crime affected roughly 1 out of every 230 Americans. But as I mentioned at the outset, only about half of all of these crimes are reported. So the numbers that you see there on the screen are reported crimes. For people who are really interested in digging down into the weeds, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is a government organization associated with the Department of Justice, collects crime data on every imaginable dimension that they collect from state and local authorities. And so you can just visit the bjs.gov website and search for whatever data you happen to be interested in. underneath the number of violent crimes, I put the rates of victimization, and I think it's important to keep these rates of victimization in mind as we go through the remaining numbers in my talk today. Blacks are victimized at a rate of about 21 individuals per thousand, whites at a rate of about 25 per thousand, and Hispanics at a rate of about 18 per thousand. That's actually a pretty meaningful disparity, because that, of course, is an absolute number and it's not adjusted for population, and because Blacks make up only about half as many absolute number of Americans as whites do. It's a pretty dramatic overrepresentation of Blacks in that rate of victimization data. And one explanation for this, of course, is that highly correlated with victimization of violent crime is household income. So that you can see that where household income is $25,000 a year or less, the rate of victimization is 41 people per thousand. Where household income is over $200,000 a year, it's 16 per thousand. So it's 2.5 times more if you're making less than $25,000 a year than if you're making more than $200,000 a year. And because we know that household income correlates linearly with race, the household income datum explains why it is that we see overrepresentation of victimization in the communities of color. This, I think, is a very interesting slide, the victim offender matrix. This is going to tell us how many victims there are of violent crime and who those offenders are. So you can see that you have the largest number of white victims. You have nearly 3 million white victims, but more than half of those offenders, or 62%, are white offenders. And what that is going to suggest is that violent crime tends to be intra-racial. That is, most white victims are victimized by a white offender. Most Black victims are victimized by a Black offender. Most Hispanic victims are victimized by a Hispanic offender. And you can see that that's true in these three categories. So of 2.8 million white victims, 1.7 million were victimized by a white person. Of 500,000 Black victims, 350,000 were victimized by a Black offender, and of 770,000 Hispanic victims, 340, a plurality, were victimized by a Hispanic offender. When you bear in mind this data, and then you process this next slide, which is the prison population, you'll really see the first, I think, very stark extent to which the prison population in the United States continues to exhibit what are really very deep roots of racism in the criminal justice system. Michelle Alexander wrote an extraordinary book a number of years ago called The New Jim Crow. And to oversimplify only slightly, Michelle Alexander argued that we can see in the prison population the contemporary remains of the racial caste system in the United States. And I think that when you look at this prison data slide and you bear in mind the previous slide, that most victims of crime are victimized by somebody who's in the same group, you can see what she's talking about. We have a total prison population of about 1.5 million. And of that total prison population, Blacks represent 1/3 of it, which they shouldn't, because we know that whites are victimized by crime at the highest rate, and that most of the people who victimize whites are themselves white. And yet whites make up only 29% of the prison population, and Hispanics are trailing at 22,000. We can also see, let me just move this so that I can see my slide, that the prison population for all of these groups has been declining. So that for the 10-year period that ended in 2018, there was a 28% reduction in the prison population for Blacks, 21% for Hispanics, 13% for whites. And the most recent incarceration data, the most recent set of complete incarceration data, we have comes from 2018. And we have, this is simply extraordinary. We have, for every 100,000 Black Americans, there are more than 1,100 who are incarcerated, which is a rate that is 6 times the rate for the white population. I don't have a slide that includes this point, but I do think that it's worth, I think, mentioning, which is that the prison population in the United States is itself, on a per capita basis, the highest incarceration rate on the entire planet, with one exception. And that one exception is the nation of the Seychelles. And what drives up the incarceration rate in the Seychelles is that they arrested and detained a lot of pirates and put pirates in prison in the Seychelles. But if you exclude the Seychelles, the United States is incarcerating more people per capita than any other country in the world. And it is particularly dramatic when compared to countries in Western Europe. So in the United States, for example, the overall incarceration rate is about 700 people per 100,000 of population. In France, by contrast, it's 103 people versus 700 in the US per 100,000. And in Germany, the incarceration rate is about 78 per 1,000 people. So we're really seeing much lower incarceration rates in other nations. This slide I put up here simply to, in a single slide, dramatize what the contrast is between the representation of the ethnic group in the population of the prison. So whites make up 60% of the population of the US. They make up 29% of the prison population. And of course, if you think back in your mind to that second slide that I put up about how most crime is intraracial, this is surprising because, of course, whites represent the highest victimized group, but most of the people who are doing the victimization are also white, and yet whites are only making up 30% of the prison population. Hispanics make up 22% of the prison population, and Blacks are making up 31% of the prison population. That is, of course, simply the mirror image of the white data point. And I'll quickly roll through this, but we talked earlier about how the biggest indicator of whether somebody's going to be a victim of violent crime is household income, where households earning less than $25,000 a year are the most at risk. And as you can see, for Blacks, nearly 1 in 3 Black households is in that category. For all of the US, it's 1 in 4. For whites, it's less than 1 in 5. It's about 1 in 6. Okay, so I now want to turn and talk in my remaining time about the death penalty, both in the United States and in Texas in particular. And when I was starting my talk, I talked about the 6 different levels where we could see racism in the criminal justice system writ large. In the death penalty context, there's an additional wrinkle. And the reason there's an additional wrinkle is because a death penalty trial is actually 2 trials. In the world of death penalty lawyers, they're called phases, but these phases are really very distinct trials. At the first trial, the jury decides whether somebody who is accused of committing a crime that would make that person eligible for the death penalty is in fact guilty of that crime. And then if the person is found guilty, then there's a second phase that's called the guilt phase, but it's really an entirely new trial where the question for the jury is whether the person who has been convicted of this crime that makes him eligible for execution will be sentenced to life in prison or will be sentenced instead to death. That first question you can think of as a question of fact. It's like, does 2 + 2 = 4, yes or no? And juries can get the answer wrong. That is, it's possible to say, oh, 2 + 2 = 5, and you'd be wrong about that. But the fact that you can be wrong doesn't mean that there's not an objectively correct answer. The second trial, or the second phase, the punishment phase, doesn't really have an objectively correct answer, because it's an ought question. It's what should we do with this person? Should we sentence this person to life in prison, or should we sentence this person to a lesser sentence, or should we sentence this person to death? And that's not a 2+2 type of question. And the more room there is for discretion, the more opportunities there are for unconscious biases to operate. The current death row population in the United States is just a hair over 2,600. Of that population, it's about evenly split between whites and blacks. Whites make up 42%. This is nationally. Blacks, 41%, Hispanics, 13%. Since 1976, there have been 1,526 executions in the United States. A third of those, by the way, a bit more than a third, have been from Texas. Whites have made up 56% of those executed, blacks 34%, Hispanics 9%. In Texas, the current death row population is about 217. Just to give you an idea, when I started representing death row inmates 25 years ago, Texas and Florida and California all had death row populations of about 400. And now, 25 years later, Florida's death row population has remained about the same. California's is over 700, and Texas's is 217. And of course, what explains that is the second line of statistics on this slide, which is the number of executions. Texas in this period has executed 573 people. California's, you could count the number on the fingers of your hands. And so the reason that California has such a large death row population vis-a-vis that of Texas now, when they were the same a generation ago, is because Texas has executed 573 people in that time period. Of those executions, 44% of them have been white offenders, 36% have been black, 19% have been Hispanic. This, I think, is extremely interesting. This I didn't put every year on here, but I put, I think, enough years so that you can see the pattern. From 1999 until 2005, the number of new death sentences dove very steeply, but then pretty much flattened. These are new death sentences per year. On the left-hand side, you see the new numbers nationally, the new number of death sentences nationally, and on the right side are those in Texas. In my line of work, we call these new arrivals on death row. So if you just look at the top line there, in 1999, there were, in the entire country, 279 people who were sentenced to death in that year. In Texas, 48. In the next year, 223 nationally, in Texas, 30. And if you just eyeball from 1999 to 2005, what you see is that there is a tapering off, particularly in the 2000s, but it's really sort of flat. It's sort of yo-yo-ish. So there were 153 in 2001, but then back up to 166 the next year, then down to 151. So we were staying up there 130, 140, 150 people a year. And then you get to 2015 and the bottom falls out. From 2015 to now, you see those numbers nationally, 49, 31, 39, 43, 34. And if you look at Texas, it's even more dramatic. In 1999, in Texas, there were 48 people sentenced to death row. As recently as 2003, there were 39 people. That's 3 a month who were sentenced to death in the state. And then in 2015, 2. The next year, 4. The year after that, 4. 2018, 6. Last year, 2019, 5. This year in 2020, I think we'll probably see 5 or maybe even fewer in Texas. So there's been a tremendous drop-off in the number of new arrivals on death row. And I think that there are several explanations for that, but one of the explanations is that people have become very sensitive to the fact that the criminal justice system makes mistakes. And there are a lot of ways that the criminal justice system can make mistakes, but one way that it can make mistakes is by sending somebody to prison who didn't actually commit the crime. And the statistics that you see right here are simply death penalty statistics. So in the United States, there have been 172 people who have been convicted and sentenced to death and then subsequently demonstrated to be innocent. And so if you just do the math and you make a ratio of the number of exonerations to the number of executions, you get a ratio of 11.2%, which another way of saying that is that for every 9 people that are executed in the United States, one of them is let out of prison altogether after his innocence is revealed. In Texas, the number of exonerations and the ratio of exonerations to executions is much lower. There have been 13 exonerations in Texas, and you end up with a ratio of exonerations to executions of about 2%. There have been a number of theories for why that is, and I will just tell you that none of the theories is that somehow that Texas makes fewer mistakes. One theory, and the theory that I'm most persuaded by, is that Texas tends not to actually save evidence. And you need evidence to exonerate people, and the gold standard for exonerations is DNA evidence. And the only big county in Texas that had been saving DNA all the way back to the early 1980s was Dallas County. And not surprisingly, the largest number of exonerations has been in Dallas County. In Harris County, by contrast, evidence has been disposed of. In Bexar County, which is San Antonio, they had a very weak evidence retention policy. So one explanation is simply that in jurisdictions where evidence is not retained, it becomes impossible subsequently to demonstrate innocence. I should tell you that there are another 5 or 6 or maybe 7 notorious cases in Texas where people are thought to have been wrongfully convicted, but the data simply don't exist yet to establish it. So I will just end here with some interesting facts about Texas, and then see if people might have some questions or some comments. Texas, as you know, has 254 counties. 136 of them have never sent anybody to death row. So nearly 1/2 of the Texas counties haven't sent anybody to death row. Harris County, the largest county in Texas, has accounted for at least, and I say at least because there are some crimes where they are multiple county crimes. So Harris County accounts for at least 280 death sentences and 127 executions. If Harris County were a state, it would rank second in the United States behind only the rest of Texas in terms of the number of executions. In third place would be Virginia. Prior to 2005, Texas executed 13 juveniles. Juvenile is defined as somebody who is under the age of 18 at the time that the homicide was committed. In 2005, the Supreme Court issued a decision called Roper against Simmons. And in Simmons, the Supreme Court said that the states cannot, consistently with the Eighth Amendment, execute people who were under the age of 18 at the time that the crime was committed. And at that time, there were 29 juveniles on death row in Texas who were waiting execution. They were moved off of death row, and they are now serving sentences of life in prison, most of them without the possibility of parole. And so I'll close, since the topic of my talk today is race in the criminal justice system. I will close with what is, to me, an extraordinarily dramatic set of data dealing with race in the death penalty. We know that about half of all homicide victims in the United States are Black. And yet, 3/4 of those who are executed were people who committed a homicide where the victim was a white. There have been 21 whites nationally executed for killing a Black, and 296 Blacks executed for killing a white. In Texas, the race of the murderer to race of the victim matrix can be seen on those following 4 lines. So where you have a white murderer and a white victim, 230 of those residents of death row um, occupy that square in the matrix. There are only 6 whites who have been sent to death row who were sent there for killing a black. And I put an asterisk next to them because 2 of those 6 actually had multiple victims, and one of the victims was not black. So there's an argument that could be made that that number should really be 4 rather than 6. Black on black crime explains 69 of the residents of death row. And then finally, black murder, white victim is 116 as compared to, as you can see, 2 lines above, 6. So I think that with that, I will stop talking and see if any of you all have any questions, comments, or anything like that that you're sending along to Catherine, who will ask me if there are any such questions.
Sure, thank you, David. And actually, Leonard had a question to kick off the questions, and there's a few that already came in. If you have another question for David, now is the time to enter it into the chat or into the Q&A tool. And Leonard, go ahead and get started, and then we'll follow up with the questions that have come in.
David, thanks very much for educating us about these figures. Could you assess for us, there's a lot of talk about criminal justice reform nationally and in different states, including here in Texas. Could you just give us your appraisal of how you see these efforts? Are they for real? Is there any success that is occurring? And from my perspective, I'm so interested in whether you believe that these will result in superior economics for the nation if they are successful, and what's at stake from that perspective.
Right.
In addition to the question of humanity and morality.
Yes. So let me start with the second part of that question, because it's actually something that I talked about in a TED talk that I gave, I guess, about 8 years ago, where I talk about the economics of punishment, particularly in the death penalty regime. It costs a lot of money to execute somebody. And the reason it costs a lot of money is in part because even though we make a lot of mistakes, we prefer not to make a lot of mistakes. And so we try to spend a good amount of money at the trial to avoid making those mistakes. Now, it turns out we're making them anyway. And so as much money as we're spending, it's still not doing the trick. But I gave a talk a number of years ago where I compared the amount of money that we spend actually sending somebody to death row and then carrying out the execution to what we might have spent to intervene in the juvenile justice system that person almost certainly passed through on the way to being an adult offender. And you're absolutely right in suggesting, Leonard, that it's hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars per case that are being squandered by solving this problem in the criminal justice system rather than in the social welfare space. So if we had much more robust social welfare interventions when vulnerable populations are in middle school, high school, vocational training stage, we'd be as a nation saving millions and millions of dollars in the criminal justice system. So that's one point. The second has to do with the recent attention to police reform. I've been around for a long time now, and so I feel like this is the 4th or 5th verse of the same song that I'm hearing. Is there more traction for it now? Quite possibly. I'm generally somebody who thinks that social media has been worse for democracy than it's been good for democracy, but I think that in certain areas that is not the case. And I think that in calling attention to the type of racism that we see in criminal justice, that might not be the case. I think that unfortunately, once again, as so often happens, the progressives are losing the messaging because it isn't abolish the police. There isn't anybody who wants to abolish the police. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I don't want to abolish the police. We need the police. Some of my best friends are homicide detectives, you know. I think that it's more a matter of recognizing that not every disturbance call requires a police officer. The most recent death that we heard about is the death of a young Black man whose family called not the police, but they called 911 and asked for EMTs to be sent because the young man was having a psychotic episode. And the police got there first. And what ended up spiraling out of control was clearly a psychotic episode. And so I don't think anybody really wants to abolish the police. I think that that is an example of people who have a good idea losing the messaging war. I think what people rightly want to do is acknowledge that many calls that police are responding to are better responded to by people who are not there drawing their weapons, but are there actually talking to the person to whom they've been called about. And so I'm somewhat optimistic that those types of reforms might grow some roots, in large part because I think that finally police chiefs in big urban areas who are the ones on the front lines dealing with these problems are also recognizing that that has to happen. And you need the police to recognize that that has to happen in order for that change to get implemented.
Thanks.
We've had a good handful of questions come in, so we'll start with the first. In violent crimes, is only one half reported? Is the same level of reporting for non-violent crimes?
That's an excellent question, and I'm just trying to remember the answer. I believe that for nonviolent crimes, an even lower percentage are reported. So it's about half of violent crimes are reported, and I believe that for nonviolent crimes, it's the number that's reported is less than half. I don't know how much less than half, but somewhat less than half.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is, who decides the policy on evidence retention by county? Can the Texas state legislatures pass a law requiring the storage/holding of evidence?
Yes, the state legislature absolutely has the authority to enact such a law. In the absence of a statewide law, it's decided on a county by county basis. So if you don't have a law that directs all local law enforcement organizations to retain evidence for whatever period of time, 5 years, 10 years, then it's decided on a county by county basis. In the ordinary practice in death penalty cases, evidence is kept until somebody is executed. And for many, many years, there were people who were single-mindedly focused on trying to prove that an innocent person had been executed. And it was just not possible to do that because once the people on death row were executed, all of the evidence was destroyed. And so once the evidence is destroyed, you can't really prove any longer that the person was innocent.
Okay, let's see. You may have touched on this, but in your opinion, what type of reform is needed to right this racism?
Boy, I didn't touch on that because that's a really, really, really big topic. And I think that is a type of reform that requires multiple layers of the criminal justice system to be involved. And so, for example, one thing that would have to be reviewed, there would have to be an audit of all police calls and arrests in order to put actual hard numbers on the fact that you have police arresting people of color for committing the same offense as white people at a rate of 3 times to 1 or 4 times to 1. And then similarly, there would have to be an audit of the charging decisions in the prosecutor's office. What we end up having in this area is a great deal of anecdotal information on those first couple of lines that I had on the first couple of slides. And I think in part the reason that we have largely anecdotal information is simply because it is really quite demanding to get that data from across the number of jurisdictions that you would need it in order to really influence policymakers. And so from my point of view, I'm a law professor. And so from my point of view, it's unfortunate that we're making so much policy on the basis of anecdotes rather than really firm, deep, rigorous data. But there's just not an incentive for the people who have the resources right now to collect that data.
Okay, thank you. Next question. The private for-profit prison system in the US is enormous. It creates an incentive to keep the inmate pipeline and cells full. What could investors do to provide alternatives to this system?
That's a problem that could also be solved legislatively. And the legislature could simply prohibit private prison corporations from housing state prisoners. It'd be harder to control at the county level, but the truth of the matter is that most of that business is operating at the state prison level rather than at the county level. And the premise of that question is absolutely correct, which is that the economics currently are such that there is an incentive to continue to criminalize conduct and convict people and send them to these private prisons because the facilities have been built and the contracts have been entered. And so we continue to send people to prison because there's a bed in the prison that we can send them to. And if we didn't have private corporations housing prisoners and had to rely just on state facilities, then I think the state would take more seriously the notion that we're sending people to prison who don't need to be in prison.
Okay. Next question. How would you rebrand, quote unquote, defund the police to a term that more accurately reflects what the intent is? For example, reform the police.
Whoever asked the question stole how I would rebrand it. Reform is way better than abolish, and not only that, but reform is actually truthful and accurate. I mean, that's what we want to do. We do want to reform. We don't want to abolish. So that's exactly the verb I would choose.
Okay. Next question. What is the public approval rating for the death penalty in the U.S. as a whole versus Texas?
Right. So actually, it's you might be surprised to know that it is not terribly different nationally from in Texas. If you ask people nationally, do you support or do you not support the death penalty, you end up with a number that's in the low 50s. It's more than half, but it's just barely above half. If you ask the same question in Texas, you get the mid 50s. That's way down from 20 years ago when it was in the high 60s, maybe even low 70s in Texas. And high 50s to low 60s nationally. Now, the additional, I think, significant fact here is that if instead of just saying, do you support or oppose the death penalty, if you say, would you be in favor of getting rid of the death penalty if we had life without parole? Or do you support the death penalty when the other choice is life without parole? The support for the death penalty dips below half nationally. It dips into the mid 40s, and even in Texas, it dips below half. So even in Texas, if you tell your typical survey recipient that the choices are death or life without parole, what do you prefer? More prefer life without parole. And one reason, I should just say, one reason that we have seen on that last slide that I showed, or one of the last slides, the very steep decline in the number of new death sentences is because there's this dynamic relationship between the number of new death sentences and the number of death penalty prosecutions, because death penalty prosecutions are very expensive. So if you're a district attorney and you think that your jury is not going to sentence your person to death, but is going to sentence that defendant to life without the possibility of parole, you don't want to spend all the money chasing a death sentence, because then you'll spend $2.5 million and you won't get a death sentence. And now you've just squandered that money. And so what happens is that as juries become more aware of the possibility that the criminal justice system makes mistakes, and therefore become more reluctant to sentence people to death, and therefore sentence fewer people to death, that translates into district attorneys seeking fewer death sentences because they don't want to run the risk that they're not going to get it. And then once that happens, once you have fewer death sentences and the district attorney seeking fewer death sentences, then all of a sudden the whole population realizes, gosh, you know what? We don't even need the death penalty at all. Let's just send these people to prison for the rest of their lives. And once that happens, you see support for the death penalty begin to erode.
Okay. Next question. Is there any improvement in preparing prisoners to re-enter a working life?
No. If you asked me to name the top 3 problems with the criminal justice system, I don't know if that would be number 1 on the list, but if it's not number 1, it's going to be number 2. And the reality is that almost everybody who goes to prison is getting out of prison. And if you send somebody into prison with no skills, and you keep that person there for 6, 8, 10 years, and you don't give that person any skills, and then the person comes out of prison and there's nobody there waiting to give that person skills, show that person how to get a driver's license, show that person where to get some vocational training, then you just have somebody who's got no prospects other than to go rob the local garage again. All of the organizations that do what we call re-entry work in my area of the criminal justice system, they tend to be all associated with churches and faith-based groups. And I think that's great. I mean, it's wonderful to me that you have churches that are sensitive to this and paying attention to it. But if there's ever an area where the government should be involved, it should be in taking these people who the government has sent to prison, and then when they get out of prison, doing your best to make sure that those former prisoners are in a position where they're not going to have to reoffend. And we simply do not have, either in Texas or in just about any other state, there may be 1 or 2 states that have some type of state-funded reentry program, a program where we take people who are out of prison and make sure that they're in a position that they have some choice other than to commit additional crimes.
Okay, we've got a few more questions that have come in. How prevalent is the use of body cams around the country?
It's very prevalent. Most at least, I don't know about smaller police departments, but large urban police departments all have funding for body cameras. Police officers wear body cameras. There is this ongoing debate. It's on the very edge of what I know anything about, but there is this ongoing debate about how those cameras should be turned on, whether they should come on automatically, whether they should always be on, or whether they should require manual operation by the officer. So that's a somewhat controversial question that divides legislators from police advocates and union representatives. But in terms of the existence of body cameras, the availability of those cameras to officers in big urban police departments, just about all of them have them.
Okay. Let's see. What is your opinion about the possibility for traction on meaningful reparations to address historical consequences of racism?
Oh gosh, my thought is that if earlier I was watching Leonard's presentation, and one of his 4 choices always was it should happen, but it won't. And my view of that is that it should happen, but it won't. You know, I recently heard an economics podcast where somebody was calculating what the cost of the 40 acre, what the value of the 40 acres and the mule would be today. So when the slaves were freed at the end of the Civil War, they were of course promised 40 acres and a mule, and they didn't get it. Instead, what they got was Jim Crow laws and racism or slavery really by a different name. And the cost of providing that 40 acres and a mule to the direct linear descendants of the slaves would, Leonard was talking about a $3 trillion infrastructure budget. It would dwarf the $3 trillion infrastructure budget. So my view is that it should but won't. I happen to think, and that's why I had the slide earlier about how economic status correlates with crime victimization better than anything else does. And my view is that the single biggest factor that operates in the criminal justice system is economics, and often economics and race simply mirror one another, but that if we could solve economic inequality, dramatic economic inequality, then we would go 3/4 of the way towards solving the problems that we have in the criminal justice system.
Okay, thank you. Looks like 2 more questions here so far. So it says, if is a falsely convicted prisoner less likely to be exonerated if sentenced to life without parole than if sentenced to death?
That's an excellent question too. Thank you for asking that. I had a slide earlier about how at the time that the Supreme Court abolished the possibility of execution for juveniles, there were 3 dozen juveniles on death row in Texas, and 2 of them were my clients. And one of my clients refused to leave his cell on death row. He had to, when a prisoner refuses to leave his cell, they call in what's called an extraction team, and the guards put on riot gear, and they tear gas the inmate, and then they forcibly remove him from the cell. And my client refused to leave his cell, and the reason that he refused to leave his cell is because he knew that as soon as he wasn't on death row anymore and he went over to general prison population, he wasn't going to have a right to a lawyer, and he wasn't going to have anybody working diligently to prove that he was innocent, because, you know, there's only so many lawyers who are doing this work. And if you have to choose between which of 3 different prison inmates you're going to work hard on behalf of, and only one of those 3 is facing execution, that's the one you're going to spend your hours working really hard on, because the stakes are the highest in that case. And so that's one of the very perverse consequences of the life without parole regime, is that I think that it artificially deflates the number of exonerations, because people are not working as hard to demonstrate that those inmates are innocent.
Okay, and the last question we have is, what is the recidivism, thank you. What is the recidivism rate for people of color offenders versus white offenders?
Boy, recidivism rates vary very much depending on what crime we are talking about. So the recidivism rate for all offenders for property crimes is pretty high. I don't know the distinction between blacks and whites, but for property crimes, burglary and robbery, for all offenders, it's pretty high. For sex offenders, it used to be believed to be high. For a generation, it was believed to be high, but it turned out that that entire belief rested on a misinterpretation of a single data point. And so it's actually pretty low. The recidivism rate for homicide, maybe this won't surprise you all. It surprised me. The recidivism rate for homicide is extremely low. And the reason that we know that is, there are 2 reasons we know that. One is that most people who commit homicide are not sentenced to death. Most people who commit homicide are sentenced to either, they're sentenced to a term of years in prison, and most of those people will get paroled. And so we have recidivism data on those people, and it's extremely low. And when I say extremely low, I mean less than 10%. And that also happens to be true for people who were convicted of homicide and sentenced to death prior to 1972. What happened in 1972 was that the Supreme Court said the death penalty was unconstitutional. And it came back in 1976. But for those 4 years, it was unconstitutional. Everybody who had been sentenced to death up until that point, who was still alive, had his death sentence thrown out. And most of those people were subsequently released from prison, because most states did not have life without parole at that time. And there was an enterprising journalist who tracked down what she called the lottery winners. That is, the people who were still alive at the time the Supreme Court got rid of the death penalty in a case called Furman against Georgia in 1972. And she tracked down, I forget what the number was, 180, 200, 210 people. And she found three of them that had attempted to commit murder out of 200. 2 of them had failed. They were drug disputes, and both people were trying to kill each other, and both missed. And there was 1 successful homicide. So that's a recidivism rate of 0.5% among people who were sent to death row. And what's of course extraordinary about that is that there is this mythology in the world of the death penalty that the people who are on death row are the so-called worst of the worst. And if you think worst of the worst, I mean, what do you think? You think, Charles Manson, Hannibal Lecter, you think wild rabid animals who, if you let them out of prison, they're just going to start killing people left and right. And the only comprehensive study that we have reveals that assumption that I think many of us have to be, it could not be more wrong. It simply could not be more wrong.
David, thank you so much for your presentation today. I know everybody found it fascinating. I'm sure of that. If people want to support your efforts, Could you let them know how they can do that?
Yeah, sure. If you want to support our efforts, you can go to the University of Houston Law Center website, and you can go to the donations page. And on the donations page, there's a little menu of programs that you can click on by clicking on the little arrow, and it opens up all the different programs. And the two that I am associated with are the Texas Innocence Network that Leonard mentioned in the introduction, as well as involved with my wife in the Juvenile and Children's Advocacy Project. And if you just highlight either one of those and make a donation, it'll go to support our work. So thank you for asking me that, Leonard.
David, thank you very much. Everybody, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We're running a little behind today, but I hope you'll stay with us. We'll reconvene, let's say at 1:50 Central Time, and we'll try to be done by 2:15 or so today, 2:15, 2:20 or so on the day. We'll try to get you out. So we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you.